Okay, so let's talk about getting a Blender asset from Blender into Starfield. This is effectively a free and open source software tutorial version of this pipeline. Things may and probably will be different if you are using 3ds Max or other tools. Speaking of which, tools that you will need in order to follow this tutorial. I currently am using the following: Blender version 3.6.5, Nifskope version 2.0 Dev 9. The revision will be posted here and in the description. The Starfield NIF migration tool, which I don't currently, I think, actively use in my pipeline, but you may want it and it may help in ways that I have since forgotten. And finally, the Starfield Geometry Bridge, the version of which will also be posted here and in the description. Now, some notes. You don't have to use these versions of these programs, but this is the setup that I found works for me. And I have seen many stories from other modders where they update one or more pieces of this, and suddenly their whole pipeline does not work and their objects do not import correctly. And that sounds like it sucks. So we are not going to do that. So let's talk about the Blender end of things. We'll be using one of my lanterns from the Ashlander hats as an example because it is a somewhat complex object. And you can see I have my mesh fully finished. It looks pretty good. And what you will note is that on the right side here, I have sort of a tree structure for my objects. This is what I have come up with that effectively copies the way Bethesda creates their own NIF files and objects. You start with your meshes and you connect them to an empty. If you do not have an empty, you can get that by using Shift A and adding an empty that is plane axes in this case. You then give it the name of what you want your object to be named when you are playing with it in the creation kit and throughout this process. Your meshes can be named whatever you want. And as part of this process, you need to have assigned a material to your mesh. It doesn't have to actually look like anything, it just has to exist so that when you import this into Nifskope, it recognizes that it is supposed to have a material attached to it. So once you have your object set up, and the reason for these separate meshes is so that I can assign materials, possibly using base game materials, without having to create a UV file for every piece of the process. Before you export, you want to make sure of the following things: your locations for your empty and each of your mesh nodes needs to be 0. The same for rotation, and your scale needs to be 1 across the board. This is important because if any of these is off, your object will not appear as intended in the creation kit or in the game. And in some cases, this can be very amusing, but mostly it's just frustrating. One of my lanterns ended up like 10 times the actual size that I wanted it, and instead of being the size of, say, a ceiling light, which was the one I was working with, it was the size of like a car. So you check and make sure that your transforms are all 0 or 1. If they are not, you select the offending piece, and in Blender, at least on Windows, you will hit Control A, which brings up the Apply menu, and you will apply all transforms while your object is selected. You will do this to each part, and then you will do this to the empty to make sure that everything is zeroed out. You also need to have created a UV map for your object. I won't get into that. There are plenty of Blender tutorials on getting that to work. If you don't have the UV map, you will not be able to use your object in the creation kit correctly. If your object appears in Nifskope and you think everything is okay and nothing shows up in the creation kit, it's very likely that your UV is incorrect or missing. Another common failure point is that the face orientation of your mesh is in the wrong direction, which can make your object look invisible even when it's not, because here in Blender, it just looks normal. And you can check face orientation here under viewport overlays. And under here near the bottom, you hit face orientation. And what you're checking is that all of your faces are blue. If any of the faces of your object are red, you will need to go into edit mode by face, select the offending face, and then use Alt-N and select flip to flip the face from red to blue. If everything is blue, your mesh setup is correct, your transforms are all zeroed out or at 1 for scale. You are now ready to export your object. For this, what you do is you select the empty and then select hierarchy from the empty. This is important because otherwise your entire object may not make it out into the NIF that you export. You then go to File, Export, Starfield NIF File. And then you select the folder that you are going to put things in. On the right, you have some options. I leave these typically exactly as they are presented to me. The only thing I change is that I unselect both of the special controls. Internal geometry data, you might not think it matters, but at some point, external geometry data turns out to work better. It is also how Bethesda actually does things for Starfield, so I recommend, as much as you can, imitating the way that Bethesda does their objects. It will save you a lot of trouble in the long run if you can mimic their process as much as possible. I also unselect generate hash names. And this is just more for me than for any particular like object related or creation kit related reason. Because if I want to replace a mesh, like say I come back and I edit my object after I created the NIF, if you know which mesh you're editing or which NIF you're editing, life is a lot easier for you, especially in the folder structure, where instead of a whole pile of strings of numbers and letters, you have things that are human readable. In this case, it would be FH Lantern 06. And so we unselect hash names, and then we hit Export Custom NIF. And at the very bottom, if it worked, you'll see Export NIF successful. If it didn't work, you will probably get an error message, and I wish you the best of luck in troubleshooting that because I mostly just end up getting frustrated. But like I said, my system works for me. This is how it works for me. I don't change it, and I continue to make my mods. So once you've got your object exported out of Blender, your next step is going to be to open Nifskope. In Nifskope, you will hit Open, and you will open the folder where your object is. You will then select the NIF and open it. But anyways, it takes a bit to load, and then your object should appear. If you've done everything correct, this is what should happen. You get your object, and it is this horrifying shade of magenta. The magenta is Bethesda speak for, I don't have a texture. So one of the first steps we need to do is give it texture. Now, an important note, because this is how I do some things, and I highly recommend that other people do it too. But when you are putting your objects into the data folders in preparation for using them in the creation kit and packing up for your mod, I highly recommend that you create a folder with the name that you're using for your mod and that you put your objects inside that folder. For instance, the Kuzuryu habs that I recently created, that's where all my NIFs go. And in geometries, I have a similarly named folder where all of the mesh files have gone. Now, this does end up complicating your Nifskope a bit, but I find the trade-off is worth it because what can happen is, as a great example, some of my stuff from a different mod is that I did not change the name of the mesh for all of my objects. And so you have things that are just named cylinder 16, cylinder 25, square 3, and so on. And it's very possible, because these are very generic, that some other modder will have a mesh by the same name. Now, if you have been naming your empty node in Blender, you shouldn't have to worry about this too much, but you never know. So I always put everything in my own folder inside geometries and meshes, and the same goes for textures, so that I don't have to worry about someone accidentally overwriting my stuff because we happened to pick the same name for our objects. And what that complicates in Nifskope is that you will have to go into each geometry node here, and at the bottom under meshes, you will have to add the folder that your mesh path lives in inside the mesh folder. So in this case, if I was naming this fh_lanterns, I would need to go here and add fh_lanterns and a slash in front of this so that Nifskope knows where my mesh is. You need to do this if you load your Nif and it appears empty. Check your mesh path. You also, this is where you can check to make sure that all of your transforms were applied. So you check your translations, which should be 0, and you check your rotation, which should all be 0, and you check your scale, which should be 1. I also recommend that you take the time to check your bound min-max, and if it does not look like it somewhat matches your object, like in this case, my object touches all of the edges of the boundary box. If this is not true, you can click on your object in Nifskope and right-click and then use Mesh and Update Bounds to change the boundaries of the bounding box. This should fix it. If it doesn't, you can also do this manually, but it is very tricky to get these numbers correct. You can see how deep the decimal points go. That said, once you've checked all of these things, you can add materials to your object, which will make it look like it really belongs. To do that, you select one of your materials. At the top where it has a name here on the left, you right-click on material and you hit Edit String Index. And then you can use Nifskope to browse the materials folder of the game, assuming that you have unpacked it. If you haven't unpacked it, this is going to be more difficult. This is also a great way to play with the materials, although it is a bit easier to look at the materials in the creation kit where the lighting will more closely match what it looks like in game, as opposed to the lighting in Nifskope, which, unless you've made serious edits to it, may not accurately reflect how this object will actually look. And so we select materials. These can be materials that you created. They can also be game materials. There's nothing restricting you beyond the fact that some materials may not look good on some objects, depending on what they were made for. In this case, my lanterns have material that I made for them, and so we'll be using that. And so it's double-clicking to add it to the little box at the bottom here, or if you know the address of the material you want to use, you could type it in directly. You hit OK, and it applies the material. And now we get a sense of what this will look like in the game. We can see through the glass. The metal is shiny. It has some interesting like pits and markings on it. And now my object kind of looks like a real object. But we're not done yet, because objects need collisions if they're going to be treated like real things in the game. And the way I fix this is that I open a second Nifskope window, and then I will browse archive to the mesh BA2 file of Starfield itself. Meshes 1 contains basically everything you're ever going to need to touch for this. And what we want to do is find an object that has a collision which is similar to the object that we are using already. If I remember correctly, when I did this for my mod, I used plant pots because they are small and have a small profile, and so should not interfere with these existing or not. So you can find, the object that most closely matches your own. In this case, I will be using one of the succulent pots. And so once we have it visible in Nifskope like this, we can then go to the block list. And under the block list, you see that this one has an extra node that mine does not have. This is our collision object that we'll be using. If you get to this point because you were using 3ds Max, 3ds Max can create collision for Starfield. So you probably won't need to do this. If, however, like me, you can't afford 3ds Max, this is basically what we do for mods, is we borrow collision from existing game objects that are most similar to our objects so that we have something that works. If your object doesn't have collision in the game, it could cause the game to treat it oddly, or it could create a non-immersive experience for players. So we find an object with collision that looks kind of like what we want our object to be, or that is roughly the same size as our object. And we right-click on it, and we go to block, and we hit copy branch. And then we can go over to our object, and we can select the top node, this 0, 9 node. And we can right-click on it, we can go to block, and we hit paste branch. And now our object has collision. The last thing that we need to do is check our BSXFlags. Like with many other things, I strongly recommend that you check this against an object that most closely resembles the one that you are using, or an object that most closely resembles what you want your object to be like in the game. It will make your life a lot easier. You won't have to wonder that if this is why your object isn't working, hopefully. So what you do here is on the object that you like from the game, you can click on the little flag icon here at the bottom where it says inner data and then has a number. And this brings up a little window that has some bits to select. You look for what the game object has selected, and this will tell you what your object needs to have selected. I don't quite know what all of these do, but I do know that Havoc is what tells the game to treat your object like it has physics. So that's pretty important. I also know that Dynamic is what lets the player use the interaction key to pick up and move your object. And it's also what, in the case of building ship parts, lets the player actually move the ship parts so that they can be attached or detached from the ship. If this bit is not selected, the object will not be movable. So on my object, we will click on the flag and we see that nothing is selected. So we will click Havoc and Dynamic and hit Accept. This number won't necessarily update correctly, but as long as the flags are checked, it doesn't matter what that inner data number looks like. You can also check the flags set at the top level node, although these are usually set by default and should not need any changes. In that you should always have bits 1, 2, and 3 selected here. Everything else will depend on what object your object is trying to resemble, but unless you are doing something complex, like something with animations, I don't recommend changing any of those. Once your object has materials, collision, and the flags are set, you can now save your object and get ready to play with it in the creation kit. So we will save as, we will overwrite the NIF that we exported from Blender because that is how this data gets saved to it. We will hit yes, and then we are done with this, basically. What you can do from here, if you are not already working in the data folders of the game, is you can take your NIF and your geometries, and your NIF goes into the, hold on a sec, the NIF goes into the meshes folder of your Starfield data folder. This is where having a folder that is named just for your mod comes in handy, because you can just dump the NIF into that folder. You can also choose to copy Bethesda's structure, which is what I did during Ashlander. In this case, all of my lanterns are in set dressing in their own special space. And then your geometries need to be put into the Starfield geometries folder. Bethesda hashes all of their geometries, and this is why I prefer to save mine without the hashing, because it makes it difficult to find out what the hell's going on. So here you can see that I have my lanterns. Each mesh file from my NIF has its own folder with its own mesh file in it. And so you just copy it from where you saved it into the appropriate folders. And now we're ready to play with it in the creation kit. Once your creation kit loads in, you're going to need to load the starfield.esm file. As a note, while we wait for this to load, make sure that you close Nifskope, or at least do not have the NIF that you were just playing with open in Nifskope while you are also using it in the creation kit. This can lead to interesting errors with your object, and in my case, it frequently leads to my copy of the creation kit straight up crashing every time I try to open that object. Okay, so once your creation kit has loaded in, I highly recommend that the first thing you do when loading Starfield ESM is that you save yourself as a new plugin file. Your mod, whatever you're working on, it keeps things clean. In this case, for the sake of ease, I have loaded in my Ashlander Living mod. This is just to make it easier for me to explain parts of the process. So because I'm using an existing plugin, I can go and find my objects already. I highly recommend when you do things like this that you name all of the stuff you build for your mod with your own little tag so that you can use this text filter to find your stuff more easily. But so, we've taken our NIF, we have done things to it in Nifskope, giving it collision and materials and making sure that it will behave the way we want it to behave inside the game. Which is nice, but how do you actually get it in the game? In this case, what we do is I recommend that you find a static object that already exists. It doesn't have to even resemble your object in the slightest. It just needs to be a static. You find one and you use duplicate and rename to create a copy of it. Then you can double click it to open your object, and the model will be whatever you copied. So we go to edit, and in this we will use the model file name to go find the object that we want to actually use for our new thing. In this case, we're not actually making a new object. I'm just explaining. But so, we could select, here's one that I didn't even use in Ashlander, just to show you what it looks like. So this circle poof didn't make it into the final version of the mod. And the preview window is always a little bit weird. But you add it, and then you hit OK. And then your object, it's hard to see, but this tiny little dot in the middle here is that poof. This was one of the objects I had scale trouble with, but you can kind of see it. We've got this button in the middle here. There we go. I can just roll it. So we have this poof. And so we want to change the ID to, what we want our object to be called, and make sure that it doesn't have the same name as something else. So in this case, I'd change it to poof, because I didn't use this in the game, and therefore it doesn't matter. Display name is unnecessary because the static is just sort of a holder. Most people are not going to see what you name it, but you are, of course, welcome to select display name there. You may need to change some of these selections depending on what your object does versus what the object you copied does. Your life will be a lot easier if you find a static object that is most closely resembling your own, or that most closely resembles how you want your own to be used in the game. One of the important things to check here is your NavMesh generation import option. Collision geometry will use the collision that you added in Nifskope, or the collision that your object natively has because you built it in 3ds Max. Bounding box will tell it to use the box that goes around your object. If you play in the creation kit enough, you know that this is the box that tells you that, what object you're moving. Filter is that basically it will not have collision. Even if it's a signed collision, which it must be in order to be a functioning object, filter tells the game to ignore that, and it or other objects will just clip through it. This can be useful in some cases on purpose, but for the most part, it will only cause problems. The other options are not really for objects. Other things here you may end up editing later, but for the most part, you do not need to touch things as long as you copied an object that is close to what you want yours to do. We will get an error message about creating a new object. We would love to create. No, we don't want to create a new form because we already have a copy. So we say no. Are we sure we want to rename this object? This object is currently in use by 0 objects and 0 references. This is important in case if you accidentally clicked this. Since we know that nothing is using this, we are completely in the clear to rename it. And now we can open a test cell, for instance. You can see I've already been using this one for my lanterns. We have, as an example, my comically large lantern. And to see what this might look like in the game engine, depending on collision you selected, which in this case, I don't think my poof actually has collision, you may end up with some weird inability to select it. But we have put it in a space. We can see that it's kind of dark and way the hell too big. But we have an object in the game. So from here, you would save your plugin, pack your files the way you normally pack your files, and then you can go and see it in the game. In you know, if you're building a house or something, obviously you would be placing this in your home and you would go check out your cell there. If you are wanting it to be a constructible object, you will need to create the constructible object forms for it. But that's basically the process. Um, it's important to note that you may run into errors and issues that I have not covered in this tutorial. I highly recommend reaching out to other modders if that becomes the case, especially ones that have clearly successfully imported objects into the game. You are always welcome to reach out to me if you need it. And that is basically it.